This is a 4-minute audio introduction to a film by the National Portrait Gallery, inviting you to explore the techniques used to create portrait miniatures. The film itself lasts about 4 minutes and features Alan Derbyshire, a conservator of portrait miniatures. Alan is a white man in his late 60s with short greying fair hair. He wears a black shirt with an open collar over a black t-shirt. His cuffs are rolled back, revealing a silver and copper bangle on one wrist. Working at a bench in a light, airy studio, Alan wears glasses and sometimes purple nitrile gloves as he handles a series of gold lockets that fit in the palm of his hand and open to reveal the face of a person painted in an earlier century. The first shows a Tudor woman with pale skin and auburn hair tucked under a black French hood, the stiff band of which frames her pale face and is trimmed with pearls. A string of pearls is looped about the woman's neck. Her features are delicately and clearly defined: blue eyes, a strong nose, and red Cupid's bow lips. Her cheeks are brushed with red. She is set against a mid-blue background, mottled by the texture on the vellum on which it's painted. A 17th century cavalier is in an oval setting that is covered with glass. He has a pale white face and shoulder-length sandy locks, falling over the high collar of his white shirt that overhangs his metal breastplate. His blue eyes regard the viewer with an uncompromising gaze. A miniature of Francis Bacon as a young man shows his head and shoulders set against a blue background with an oval frame. The youth is dressed in a black cassock with a stiff white ruff. Bacon has short brown hair with tresses curling over his ears and the pale skin of his forehead. His eyes are blue and slightly narrowed, his gaze perhaps mistrustful under delicately depicted brows. His lips are picked out in red, with a hint of down on his upper lip. A Latin inscription following the curve of the frame is written in gold, the lettering mostly too small to read, except for the date, 1578. Other miniatures show more complete scenes, including a nobleman in elaborately chased armour. He's standing on a field beside a tent, with an armoured horse and distant mountains in the background. Alan demonstrates the making of a miniature by pasting a rectangle of vellum about 10 centimetres by 5 onto a card of slightly smaller dimensions. He burnishes or rubs it with an animal's tooth that is attached to a stick the size of a pencil. Using his finger, he mixes powdered pigment with gum arabic in a mussel shell that he balances on the fingers of his other hand. He paints the picture onto the vellum using a fine brush bound to its handle with twine. Later, he adds dots of paint with a needle mounted on a wooden shaft, heating the needle in a candle flame. 18th century miniatures are painted on translucent ivory, meaning when set against a foil backing, they glow, reflecting the light. One shows an elderly gentleman in a black frock coat and white necktie. His naturalistic features under his periwig are caught with almost photographic realism. He smiles benignly, his gaze passing over our right shoulder. White letters on purple, National Portrait Gallery.
So my name's Alan Derbyshire, and I first started working with portrait miniatures back in the early 1990s. Miniatures were originally created, as far as we know, around about the 1520s. So if people were travelling, going abroad, people would have a miniature painted of their loved ones that they could keep and either wear as a piece of jewellery or keep locked away somewhere. Occasionally they would be hung on the wall as a cabinet miniature. So I think my favourite miniature in the National Portrait Gallery is the miniature Francis Bacon, painted by Heliot in 1578 when he was just 18 years old. It's a beautiful, beautiful miniature, and it's very, very fresh in terms of colour. In the 16th century, miniatures were painted on vellum. The vellum was incredibly fine, animal skin. It needs to be laid down onto something to keep it flat. So normally they would lay the vellum down onto a piece of pasteboard or card, and commercially available playing cards were around at the time. So artists would take a piece of playing card, they would paste up the back of the vellum using essentially flour paste, and then they would apply it to the playing card, burnish it down with a dog tooth burnisher, which allowed the vellum and the pasteboard to stick together nicely. So if you look at the 16th century miniatures, those touches of gold and silver which you see on them, they're very shiny. That's achieved by painting the shell gold or shell silver onto the surface of the miniature and then burnishing with even perhaps a stoats tooth, something nice and small but smooth. Pigments, they vary. They can be minerals dug out of the ground and powdered to a fine powder that then can be mixed with something like gum arabic. So when you have the powdered, naturally occurring mineral, it needs something to bind it together into a paint. So if you mix something like gum arabic with the powdered mineral and then add water, you have a paint. Gum arabic is essentially a resin from the acacia tree. So it's like a sticky, naturally occurring glue, if you like, that binds the pigment together. They would start with what we call a carnation layer. It's meant to represent the flesh tone of the sitter, and that would be painted onto the vellum. And then the artist would paint define the features of the sitter on that layer. The excess carnation could be removed with a wet brush, and that would then allow the rest of the miniature to be painted. For example, the blue background that you see, or the costume. So Nicholas Hilliard also in the 16th century, he created this way of creating a simulated ruby, for example. So this, he would use turpentine resin, to which he would mix, in the case of rubies, a red pigment. But this is it is a resin. It's not something you can pick up with a paintbrush. So you'd have to pick it up with a hot needle. So he would use a hot needle to pick up the tinted resin and place it onto a little area of burnished silver paint. The silver would act as a reflector, and then the turpentine resin on top of that would appear to be the ruby. As we get into the beginning of the 18th century, artists begin to use ivory. So the difference between painting on vellum and on ivory is really the appearance. Vellum is a very matte surface on which to paint, and so the layers of paint are also pretty matte. But when it comes to ivory, has got a translucency, it's got a special quality. And I think this was the other attraction to artists, to make use of ivory and to try and make use of its translucency.
White letters on purple invite us to explore the collection, npg.org.uk. Audio description written by Louise Fryer and voiced by Fern Lulham for Vocalise.